This IELTS academic writing task 1 answer would get the top score. Let me show you how to write it using the system I've tested on my 30,000 course students. I promise it will get you a few steps closer to that band 7, 8 or 9 score. Starting with the task, I've selected quite a tricky bar chart from Cambridge practice tests. The chart below gives information about how families in one country spent their weekly income in 1968 and in 2018. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. And below we see a horizontal bar chart, 1968 and 2018 average weekly spending by families. So on the left, we see what they spend the money on: food, housing, fuel, and so on. If you look at the bottom, each bar shows a percentage of total spending. For example, look at the food at the very top. We see that in 1968, families spent 35% of their income on food. By 2018, that percentage fell down to about 17%. There is a lot of information and only 20 minutes. So what do you do when the timer starts? The chart gives details about how families spend their weekly income in 2 different years, 1968 and 2018. It is interesting because these days we all know that food is becoming so expensive and a lot of people are struggling financially. I swear, during the exam I took recently, a third of the room started typing their answers 30 seconds into the writing exam. The problem is that this answer already has 2 big mistakes. Can you spot them? Look at the first sentence. It's just repeating the words from the question. The chart gives details. Families spend their weekly income. Make sure you're not copying phrases from the question, but paraphrasing. Now look at the second sentence. It's expressing opinions and knowledge outside the question. You must not do that in task 1. That's what task 2 is for, but in task 1 you must describe the data in front of you. So let's start again with an introduction and I show you how to paraphrase, starting with a simpler version and going all the way up to the band 9 level. Here is the first. The bar chart provides details of the average expenditure on a series of 8 items by families in a given country in the years 1968 and 2018. The chart becomes a bar chart, gives information is provides details. Average weekly spending is average expenditure. And we add the 8 items from the chart. In a country is in a given country. And we add in the years at the end. If you're comfortable with this level, let me show you a more advanced introduction. Some of the vocabulary can really come handy. The bar chart displays the percentage breakdown of how households in a particular country allocated their weekly expenditure across 8 categories in the years and so on. So when we have shares of 100%, like in our case, their income is 100%, or if you have one of those round pie charts with percentages, you can say the percentage breakdown. Families in this case are households or people who live together, and they allocate their expenditure across categories, or they spend money on 8 categories of items. There are a couple of other phrases that you may like, so let me show you another introduction. Here it is. The bar chart presents data on how average household expenditure was distributed across 8 categories in a certain country in 1968 and 2019, expressed as percentages. Expenditure was distributed, that's the passive voice. And if you want to say that the numbers are percentages, not amounts, you can say expressed as percentages. I'm showing you band 9 writing, but remember that simple and correct is better for your score than complex and wrong. So choose the level that is right for you. Now we're moving to the arguably most important sentence or paragraph of your answer, the overview. Why is it so important? Because you won't get a band 7 for your task response unless your answer presents a clear overview. By the way, the examiner should also judge that main trends and differences are identified and key features are selected. So we do need to analyze our chart carefully before we can write anything else. First of all, what are the key features and main differences? When we're spending money, it's more important where we spend the most, not the least, right? So we're looking for the biggest spending. In 1968, that's food, and everything else was actually under 10%. In 2018, that's leisure, housing, food, and transport. What about the biggest differences between our two time periods? We can see that spending on food went down a lot, while housing went up, as well as transport and leisure. There are a lot of smaller items or smaller changes, and we'll mention them briefly in our report, but they're less important. In the overview, we need to tell the reader, the examiner, the main points, not the details, but the big picture. Again, I have two versions for you, starting with the more straightforward overview. Overall, the way households allocated their income changed significantly over the period. Overall is a useful linker to show the examiner where your overview is. Then we give a general statement saying that there were a lot of changes. A great collocation to use is to allocate income. Households allocate their income. And now the biggest changes. While expenditure on food halved, spending on leisure, housing, and transport increased substantially. I know that many students would just finish their overview here, but it's incomplete. We need one more sentence. In contrast, the remaining 4 categories accounted for relatively small proportions of total spending. So you need to touch on all the categories. In this overview, we have a complex sentence with while and a great linker in contrast. Yet, the language is relatively simple, and I think this style of writing is best for most students. But if you're curious, here is the next level. Overall, the data reveals a notable shift in household spending habits. The meaning is the same, but the language is higher level. A notable shift in spending habits are great collocations. And I'm also adding the changes to the same sentence. So look at this. We'll put a comma and continue. So a notable shift in household spending habits with a sharp decline in food expenditure and substantial increases in spending on leisure, particularly along with housing and transport. So we have the same main differences as before, but the sentence structure is more complex. And the phrase spending on leisure particularly means spending on leisure particularly increased. The next sentence is, meanwhile, the remaining 4 categories consistently represented a relatively minor share of total expenditure over the 50-year span. Consistently represented means they were always lower. And instead of a 50-year period, we can say a 50-year span. And please note that we say a period of 50 years, but a 50-year period. So we have a hyphen and no S at the end, just 50 years. For example, I was on holiday for 7 days. My 7-day holiday was lovely. Here, my students sometimes think, okay, the overview's done, now I just need to report all the percentages and I'm done. Not that easy. let me show you how to write body paragraphs that can get a band 8 or 9 score. First of all, we need to have at least 2 body paragraphs, not 1. How can you organize our answer? There are at least 2 ways to choose from. First, we'll write our introduction and overview, usually in 1 paragraph, but you may split them into 2 if your overview is longer. Then, in the first body paragraph, we can describe the first period, 1968, and in the second, so be careful here. You shouldn't just describe 2018. You need to show the changes. Or we can describe the spending items that went down between 1968 and 2018 in the first body paragraph, then those that went up, and finally those small items where we didn't see a lot of changes. I'm going to use the first structure in my answer. And yes, your structure is important because the examiners do assess if information and ideas are logically organized and if paragraphing is used well. So knowing how important this structure is, you may ask, don't I have to write a conclusion? No, that's not necessary in task 1. Some people like to put the overview at the end as a kind of conclusion, and that's fine. But I don't recommend leaving this very important part until the end in case you're running out of time. So here is how to write band 8 or 9 body paragraphs. I'm describing 1968. In 1968, families spent a little over a third of their weekly income on food, making it by far the largest spending category. We're not just listing all the percentages, which could be seen as mechanical and lower your score. We're interpreting them. 1/3 on food was the largest spending category. Housing and clothing each accounted for 10%, and together with food, these 3 categories made up more than half of total expenditure. I've shown the largest expenses. Now, let me compare them to the small expenses. Remember the task says make comparisons? I'm actually continuing the same sentence. Whereas the remaining 5 items surveyed each ranged between 6% and 8%. I like how in this paragraph we mix percentages with fractions, like over a third or more than half. It is important that you vary the way you present numbers in your report, and here is how you can do it. If you're talking about 100%, you can say all, the whole, all of the income, the entire population. 75% is 3/4 or a large majority, most. 66% is 2/3. 50% is a half or just half, or 1 in 2. For example, 1 in 2 school children plays sport. 33% is a third or 1 in 3. 25% is a quarter or 1 in 4. 20% is a fifth or 1 in 5. There are some more interesting ones. So 10% is 1/10 or a small minority. 1 in 10. And 5% is a tiny fraction or a very small share. Variety in your vocabulary is as important as our next requirement that students often don't pay enough attention to. I'll show you what that is in the next paragraph. But if you're lacking vocabulary for task 1, my course students get a specially designed vocabulary with the most important words and phrases for task 1 that we don't use every day. And they also learn how to analyze each chart, map or table, how to write answers that will get a band 7 or higher. And if you want to save time and achieve a better result, I'll link the courses below. Now, the important thing I mentioned before is if your ideas flow, if they're connected to each other. And that's what I want you to pay attention to while listening to the next paragraph. The flow. 50 years later, Although food still accounted for 17% of household spending, this figure halved from 1968. We begin with 50 years later to immediately tell the reader what's in this paragraph. And we start with the biggest change, spending on food. Next. Similarly, spending on clothing and footwear dropped from 10% to 5%. Similarly is a great linker when we're talking about similar trends, like expenses that went down. What's the opposite of similarly? In our case, in contrast. In contrast, leisure, which initially represented only 8% of spending, almost tripled to 22%, becoming the largest spending item. The linker in the next sentence is more subtle. Both housing and transport also saw notable increases, rising from 10% to 19% and from 7% to 14% respectively. Respectively means in the same order as something was mentioned. Housing was first, it rose from 10 to 19%, and transport was second, so its numbers are last, from 7 to 14%. Now, body paragraph 3 about the items where we didn't see much change. As for the remaining items, spending on household goods remained unchanged at 7%, while expenditure on both personal goods and fuel and power saw slight declines, with each registering 4% in 2018. Just one complex sentence. The smaller the spending, the less attention we pay to it. And if you liked this lesson and you're looking for more in-depth step-by-step preparation, I'm sure you'll like my courses, where you can learn everything you need to get a Band 7+ in writing and speaking. These courses will help you save time and achieve a higher score. I'll link them below. And the best next step on YouTube is to watch this super in-depth lesson on writing introductions to each type of academic task 1. This is actually a free preview from my courses. And thank you so much for watching me today. Good luck with your preparation and your exam. Bye!